DOGE and its cuts across the government. These events will make clear how Donald Trump's campaign to cut public services is harming all of us. I know that the stories we've been hearing about DOGE can seem far away, really intangible, hard to imagine even, but in reality, we all use these services that Donald Trump is trying to destroy. These cuts are going to hurt you and people you care about. They're going to make every American less safe. Indeed, they already are. Today, the Center for American Progress is hosting Todd Carter, a leader at a housing not-for-profit in North Carolina. We're also hosting David Dixon, an award-winning meteorologist and environmental journalist, and Dr. Michael Morgan, the former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction. David, Todd, and Dr. Morgan will be speaking about how Trump's drastic cuts to weather forecasters and the National Weather Service will make Americans less safe. Meteorologists all across the country use the data that the National Weather Service collects to provide accurate forecasts. When you turn on the TV in the morning or look at the weather app on your phone, you are benefiting from those forecasts. But now, Trump is shutting down broad swaths of the Weather Service so that he can give himself and other billionaires a huge tax break. Without the Weather Service, we wouldn't be able to predict extreme weather events with the speed and accuracy needed to protect lives. We wouldn't be able to protect our families and homes, and businesses large and small would suffer. So we will be less healthy, our economy will do worse, and all of us will be less safe because of Trump's actions. And this is a story that is playing out over and over again across multiple agencies and millions of people's lives. Trump is cutting our air traffic control systems, endangering everyone who travels by airplane. Trump is cutting Social Security offices, potentially interrupting Social Security services for millions of seniors. Trump is cutting wildfire prevention experts, leaving families vulnerable to losing their homes and even their lives. And Trump is even laying off veterans who help prevent the suicides of other veterans. Think about that. Think about the consequence of that. I'll be honest, this is only the beginning. Donald Trump is making these cuts in order to ensure that there are tax cuts for him and his billionaire friends. Even though these cuts are hurting you, they are really designed to help him and his friends. But we also can't forget that Trump is presenting us with a false choice. We can shrink the deficit without cutting essential services. We can balance the budget without destroying public services, and we can present a vision of change that's not a wrecking ball, one that actually solves people's problems. So I hope you'll learn a lot from Dr. Morgan, David, and Todd today. And then I hope you'll bring those lessons into the real world and use them. Take a stand and make your voice heard. And now I will turn it over to CAP's Associate Director for Federal Climate Policy, Lucero Marquez.
Thank you so much for that intro, Neera. Hi, folks. Thank you all for joining our webinar covering the DOGE layoffs and funding cuts affecting the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and how the gutting of their staff and resources will impact millions of Americans. I am Lucero Marquez, Associate Director for Federal Climate Policy here at the Center for American Progress. Now, before I introduce our panelists, just a couple of housekeeping items. Live captioning is available using the closed captions tab at the bottom of your screen. We will also be taking your questions at the end of the program. Please feel free to submit them using the questions tab on your screen. And so without further ado, here with me today are David Dixon, Todd Carter, and Dr. Michael Morgan. David is an award-winning meteorologist and science journalist. During his time in broadcast television, he covered hurricanes, tornadoes, and other extreme weather events and highlighted the ongoing impacts of climate change on the southeastern United States. Currently, he is a TV engagement coordinator for Covering Climate Now, helping broadcasters link climate change to their stories. With us today as well is Todd, the Chief Development Director for Hospitality House of Northwest North Carolina. Hospitality House works to rebuild lives and strengthen community by providing a safe, nurturing, and healthy environment in which individuals and families experiencing homelessness and poverty-related crises are equipped to become self-sufficient and productive. He also serves on the Boontown Council, the board of directors for Ashe County Coalition for the Homeless, and has co-founded numerous community groups like the High Country LGBTQ Youth Alliance, Boone Pride, and the Watauga Back to School Festival. And last but not least, with us today is also Dr. Morgan, a professor in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the former Assistant Secretary for Commerce for the Environmental Observation and Prediction, where he was responsible for providing NOAA-wide direction with regard to weather, climate, and ocean observations, including in situ instruments and satellites, and the process of converting observations to predictions for environmental threats as well. He has also served on numerous boards and committees, including the World Meteorological Organization Science Steering Committee, and on the Board of Trustees of the University Cooperation for Atmospheric Research. So thank you to our three panelists today for taking the time to discuss this incredibly important matter with all of us today. The news is filled with reports of the mass layoffs affecting thousands of federal employees. For NOAA specifically, many workers received notice that their time at the agency had concluded just a few short weeks ago. In the following days, the consequences of the layoffs were pretty evident. Local National Weather Service summer internships were canceled, prompting concerns about students' professional futures. And the National Weather Service also announced the suspension and reduction of the frequency of weather balloon launches in a couple locations across the country, which are in fact an essential piece of the weather forecasting system. In the past week, federal workers have been reinstated at NOAA due to court order, but probationary employees were placed on administrative leave, not really clear if they would be asked to return back to work. On top of all the uncertainty, DOGE aims to cut more NOAA jobs, and there are even threats to the future of some NOAA buildings like the Mauna Loa Observatory, which tracks CO2 amounts in the atmosphere, not just for the United States, but for the entire world. Does anybody know the Keeling curve? I hope some folks do. And also for the Center for Weather and Climate Prediction, which houses the very models used in national day-to-day weather forecasting. So, Dr. Morgan, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is an incredibly large agency with many different line offices built into it, like the National Weather Service, but also the National Ocean Service and the National Environmental Satellite Data and Information Service. Before we take a dive into NWS specifically, could you describe the ecosystem that is NOAA and what kind of work can we find staff doing on a day-to-day basis?
Okay. Thank you, Lucera, and I'm delighted to be part of this panel today. So NOAA is really about the people, and you mentioned the line office structure. First, I'll talk about the people and the mission. NOAA's mission is science, service, and stewardship, understanding and predicting changes in the climate, weather, oceans, and coast, as well as the Earth's space environment, sharing that knowledge and information with others, and managing coastal and marine ecosystems and resources. This is accomplished by a dedicated staff in a number of these line offices that were mentioned before. One of them is the Office of Marine and Aviation Operations, or OMAO. They're responsible for operating the ships that map the seafloor and monitor oceanographic and atmospheric conditions, as well as the aircraft, the Hurricane Hunter aircraft, as an example, that go and fly out in our storms over the Atlantic or over the Pacific during the wintertime to look at what are called atmospheric rivers. They collect this data, and it's essential for improving our prediction of hurricanes and flood prediction. The coastal work that's done by the ships helps with charting coastal ways to make sure they're navigable, as well as using some other aircraft for disaster response and resource management, mapping areas that have been experienced disasters and the damage. There's a National Ocean Service, which is responsible for providing information about the oceans and coast and ensuring that coastal communities are safe. There's also the, I could go through all these line offices, but I know time is short. There's the Office of Atmospheric and, or Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, which is one of the principal fundamental line offices, which is responsible for doing the fundamental research that's done to help us better understand how we can improve our forecast, how we understand the ocean circulation, evaluating climate change using some of that data collected at Mauna Loa as an example, but also looking at the next generation of technologies that are going to help advance NOAA's accomplishing its mission. Finally, two others that don't want to leave out: the National Environmental Satellite Data and Information Service. This is responsible for the operation and also the acquisition of satellite technology to help us with our weather forecasting. They also have, they manage significant data archives, which are freely available to the public to understand the impacts of climate change, short-term weather, and this data is available to anyone that wants to have access to it. And then finally, of course, the National Weather Service, whose responsibility really is in the protection of lives and property and ensuring the effective conduct of commerce. All these line offices form an ecosystem that contributes to the Weather Service's work. NESDIS in the development of models and improving those models, looking at how we can better use data. National Ocean Service in getting and collecting data in coastal communities that feeds into Weather Service advisories, watches, and warnings. And OAR, which is, again, doing that fundamental research. So this is really a very tightly focused ecosystem, and the folks that do this work are highly dedicated in what they do. I hope that helps address your question.
Oh, very much so. I was just thinking how I'm also a meteorologist. And so when I went to undergrad, I thought I was going to be a storm chaser and I wanted to chase tornadoes and things like that. And through my undergrad studies, I was really shocked when my professors would be like, actually, we don't know much. Like there's so much more we can learn about tornadoes. And at the time, I was just like, well, we don't know how tornadoes are formed and things like that. So the research aspect that you touch on is incredibly important, not just for like our day-to-day, like tornadoes and hurricane forecasting, but also long-term for climate and understanding, something like ocean currents and how that has implications to our climate here too. I love the point that you touched on. Maybe you can expand a little bit more. This is public data, right?
Right.
This is incredible. Can you describe a little bit more on why that is important that it's public?
Right. Well, part of the reason that it's important that it's public is that NOAA is committed to ensuring that it conducts its work with equity to all interested parties, making sure that that data gets out to both rural and urban communities across our country. And also we interact with other communities around the world in both sharing the data, which is also, we can't observe every square inch of the planet and the environment around the planet. So we have to work with other nations to collect that data. But that data is publicly available to everyone. As an example, the importance of this data, companies like our nation's airlines, Delta, United, et cetera, UPS and FedEx use NOAA's weather forecast products that are essential for their operations. Companies like Google and Microsoft, people may have heard in the news that they're developing these AI-driven models. That comes directly from the data that NOAA provides freely and openly to both the public and private sectors, as well as private sector weather forecast. I'm sure David's going to say something about that. That data gets out there. And so every one of these private sector enterprises, parts of the private sector enterprise, relies on NOAA's data every second of every day. And also NOAA is, the private sector is growing thanks to NOAA's data via the NOD, that's NOAA's open data dissemination system. New environmental forecast companies have been created over the last few years using this freely available data. It's open access, no charges for downloading the data from the major cloud service providers in the United States. And these companies are spinning up and creating new enterprises and new innovation. I think that's a great thing. And, again, finally, we share this data globally. It's available at no cost to the public. We've paid for it once, and it's now available to everyone to do the work that they need to do.
Exactly, very much so. I think you, to wrap it all up, it's clear, well, at least it's starting, hopefully it's clear, but there's a reason why NOAA is under the Department of Commerce. All of what you just described have impacts to our economic well-being. And the federal government realized this and placed NOAA under Commerce for a specific reason. So thank you for that answer and those responses. David, let's move to you. For weather specifically, as we've been talking, the National Weather Service collects a lot of data that we rely on and receive from broadcast meteorologists to the weather apps literally on our phone. What are all the different ways that the National Weather Service utilizes to collect weather data, and maybe touch on a little bit more on how the information is made publicly available for everyone to use?
Absolutely. And thanks again for having us all on this panel. It's very very important, especially as we move into uncharted waters over the next couple of months and potentially for the entire administration. I do want to just briefly touch on something Dr. Morgan said, and you mentioned it as well. There's a reason the National Weather Service and its parent organization, NOAA, is under the Department of Commerce. Every single thing our economy runs on is a basis in weather. Just for the cup of coffee paid by the average taxpayer per year, the National Weather Service gives in excess of $100 billion to the US economy. That's why this is so important. And this is also why it's so important for NOAA to have and the National Weather Service to have robust ways of gathering weather data. As meteorologists, we use this weather data for all of our forecasts, whether it's just a sunny day or an extreme weather event, such as the springtime severe weather season that really kicked off last week with a big round of storms passing through the deep south and into the southeast. The protection that the National Weather Service provides in the coverage before these storms even arrive and preparing these communities about the threats, preparing these forecasters, whether it's the private organizations, the broadcast meteorologists tracking these storms on air, and then after the fact, going through the damage surveys and seeing what exactly went well and what can we do to improve, just shows why this data set is so important. And unfortunately, as you mentioned before, we're seeing impacts to this data set that are likely going to be almost like the butterfly effect. You think of something small and seemingly insignificant to the average consumer of a weather balloon launch in Alaska or Wisconsin and upstate New York. You're like, well, what does that matter in the long scheme of things? Well, unfortunately, currently how we forecast storms, and again, the atmosphere is a deep system. It's a 3D system. The way that we get a vertical slice of readings of data, of weather data, atmospheric pressure, temperature, humidity, the best way we do that currently is through weather balloon launches, which have been frequently done twice a day at the, I forget how many National Weather Service offices there are. I believe it's like 150 or something like that. But that allows us to bring in that data into weather models, but also provides that data for the extremely experienced National Weather Service offices, the meteorologists, the forecasting directors there, the warning coordinators there that work 24/7 to have a better understanding of what the environment is doing. And that data is extremely important when it comes to these severe weather days. Could potentially mean the difference of seeing a tornado outbreak versus, well, we're just going to see straight line winds. It's that weather balloon data is incredibly important. And although we really haven't seen too much of an impact with our current extreme weather events and the severe storms, with these disruptions, it's only a matter of time that we will likely see disruptions to public safety and the accuracy and efficacy of these forecasts and alerts as we see further reductions to the National Weather Service, not only in the staffing at these National Weather Service offices, which unfortunately were already understaffed, but also the impacts that we're seeing to our weather models, which make up the, I would say, the invisible backbone of all weather forecasts, whether you get it from your National Weather Service on their website, whether it's through your iPhone app, whether it's through your broadcast meteorologist on your favorite local television station. We're likely going to see impacts due to this. And then it also comes down to the tools that we use to help forecast our changing weather, whether it's weather balloons, but also radar. Radar is a huge thing. It's the only tool that we have as meteorologists to see inside of a storm and see what is happening. And unfortunately, we're seeing reductions due to the technicians that help repair these radar sites that unfortunately are also aging as well. I could go on and on. In fact, I like to say, if you ever need a story idea or want to learn about the far-reaching impacts of weather, ask a meteorologist. They will have a lot of different stories to tell you.
I totally agree. Thank you so much, David. It's so insightful. I think, would it be helpful, since you are still technically a broadcast meteorologist, can you kind of walk us through like a day and how you have gone in the past, go from you're receiving information from the National Weather Service, and then how you've relayed that information to the public, and then the like preparations you've seen folks do in anticipation for an upcoming event, like that, in which those responses are very important.
Absolutely, because I think there is a disconnect from the average weather and news consumer compared to who's actually producing the forecast. And I think that's why this webinar and highlighting NOAA and the National Weather Service's importance is just so vital, because there is a disconnect of people saying, well, I don't need NOAA, I don't need the National Weather Service. I get alerts and I get data from my phone telling me if it's going to rain or if there's a tornado warning or something like that. So people generally know where to get forecasts, but they don't know where that data comes from. And at the heart of it, it is the National Weather Service. It is NOAA. Even as a broadcast meteorologist, I would say the overwhelming majority of the data and the weather information I presented on the news and put out there, again, was directly correlated to National Weather Service data. So on a regular day, let's say I just come in, it's anticipated to be a severe weather day or a active day. I'm looking at data from the Severe Prediction Center, which is, again, a part of National Weather Service that puts outlooks. They have extremely experienced meteorologists looking at the atmosphere and predicting days ahead of an event if it is going to be active or not. So that is one aspect. And you might see those like warning days or red alert days on your national or even local weather channel that tell you, okay, something's going to happen. But even as the event is unfolding, those alerts, those warnings aren't being pushed out by your local television station. It's not being pushed out by your phone. All alerts related to weather come from your local National Weather Service office. Whether that's an extreme heat warning, whether it's a tornado warning, flood warning, anything like that, that is coming from the National Weather Service office. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. It's not only accountability, it's not only to see a commonality among forecast offices. You know, if I travel from the Carolinas, where I am right now, head out to the Pacific Northwest, that extreme heat warning and those other alerts are fundamentally going to be the same. It's just different on how we distribute them. For myself, I was distributing them through television and through push alerts from our favorite weather app. But again, the basis of that comes from the National Weather Service. That data comes from the National Weather Service. Even the radar and the rain that we're showing on air and the radar app on your phone, again, comes from the National Weather Service data. To argue the not need for the National Weather Service just because you have a private weather app would be essentially to argue we don't need farmers because we have grocery stores. So again, everything that we use and almost every type of weather information that you see, no matter where it comes from, again, has its heart in the National Weather Service.
Yeah, thank you, David. What an analogy you just painted for us that I actually very much do agree with. We do need the National Weather Service. Todd, I'm turning over to you. You just heard David, the various ways that he was able to distribute information to communities. Last fall, Hurricane Helene demolished your community in Boone, North Carolina, alongside many other communities in the southeastern United States. Can you walk us through what kind of warning you all received and what you were able to do to prepare prior to Hurricane Helene's arrival?
Yes, thanks, Lucero. We were we got the National Weather Service alerts as we do. We're part of the Watauga County emergency management team that we were getting the alerts, and as a homeless services provider, we actually are a regional agency that covers 2,600 square miles in 7 counties, and 5 of our counties were incredibly devastated. So our first order of business was contacting service providers across those counties to make sure people who were living outside got to shelter. That was number one. Then shoring up our staffing to handle because there's only one shelter in our region that we operate it for the 7 counties. Primarily, we operate 15 different housing programs. So we had to concern ourselves with our clients that were living in apartments that were in floodplains. And I will say the storm was more than what we expected. We, it was a lot bigger impact. I don't think anyone was prepared for this. Although we might have had an inkling since 2 days before that, on the Wednesday, a tornado hit Blowing Rock, North Carolina. So we're not supposed to have tornadoes in the mountains. And so the tornado and the devastating effects of Helene, we made it through, but boy, it was scary.
Yeah, I totally hear you. I think any time someone experiences a severe weather event, you can experience a lot of different emotions that are just so intense, nerves, fear, things like that. And I think it's only heightened with you and your community when you're actively working to, help people who are experiencing a bunch of different compounding factors on top of each other. And then you add something like a hurricane and all these impacts. It just only makes things worse. Can you talk us through a little bit more what happened during the hurricane? How were you keeping, you and others up to date with what was happening outside? And then maybe touch on a little bit more on like the resources and support you all got in the short term after the hurricane.
Well, I will say the work of NOAA and National Weather Service, it saves lives. And our job is to save lives and keep people safe during any kind of crisis assistance. Like so, we are frontline folks, and we have got to be here to help people. And the water rose and rose and rose, and our communication was completely cut off. Our cell towers went down. Literally, our one staff member was standing outside in the middle of the hurricane trying to reach our executive director, who was also could not get out of her home. Streets turned into rivers. One of our clients in an apartment, she was crying for help. She got to the very top of the roof of her apartment building, and she was telling our executive director, Miss Tina, I can't swim. I can't swim. And she's 75 years old and was afraid she was going to die. And we had another 72-year-old gentleman that had to be rescued by boat. And our primary facility here in Boone is right next to one of the most impoverished areas. They were bringing people by boat down the roads to us, and our staff are doing the best they can. Water was coming into our building. The roads were impassable. And since that time, Phil Heisel, Northwest for National Weather Service in Blacksburg, has reached out to us, and he said, I did not realize how critical your services were, what area you covered. So now this latest storm that we had coming in, we got the emergency alerts before anybody else because we got on that ahead of alert system. He was like, you need to be on this. And we have meetings with him about you need to get NOAA radios and all of so if your communication goes down. So we've got this great relationship now, and where we feel like we're in a position. So it's gut wrenching to think that Phil could lose his job, that we could lose that connection, that we're not going to have these kind of resources for the next disaster that comes our way.
No, thank you so much for sharing your story. The impacts you describe are heartbreaking, right? A woman who is 75 isn't able to swim, crying, asking for help on the top of her roof. That's very heartbreaking. And the tie that you were just able to make, if resources go away, that fear of what will happen next, that uncertainty isn't isn't there, is there, right? Thank you for sharing your story, Todd. Dr. Morgan, I'm going to shift to you. After hearing Todd's story here, we've already walked through how NOAA and how the National Weather Service works, and how their efforts do translate into getting information that the public uses to make decisions, right? Todd was able to go see who needed help right before the Hurricane Helene actually impacted their community. So DOGE cuts to staffing and resources will have impacts on the National Weather Service and NOAA. How do these cuts and potential cuts translate into impacts for the American public?
Okay, thanks for that question. I think it really clearly articulated some of those impacts. The loss of staff means that forecast offices that were already and unfortunately historically understaffed because of lack of resources and just how hiring is done, those forecast offices are going to be even further understaffed, maybe even leading to potential closing of some offices, which would be an extreme event if that were to occur. We've already seen the impacts of loss of staffing now by the reduction and suspension of some of those radiosonde launches that David mentioned earlier. I think there's 7 locations in the country right now in which 2, they've totally stopped these balloon launches, with the exception of if there is a severe weather or there's an urgent need to get those observations, they'll be able to perhaps turn a switch and take those observations. But the regular collection of data from 2 stations is just totally turned off. 5 other stations just late last week, some in the Midwest, were told to halt all of their morning launches for balloons. And that's data that's used, as David's already mentioned, in local severe weather forecasting, aviation, and marine forecast, as well as it's the fundamental input that goes into some of our computer-based numerical weather prediction models. So we're going to lose data because of this staffing, and that loss of data then translates into a less precise forecast, more uncertainties in the forecast grow. Does it mean every single forecast is going to be poor? No, but it does mean that the uncertainties in our forecast will grow over time. We're losing also an impact longer term is a lot of these balloon sites, these radiosonde launch sites, that data has been regularly collected for decades, and there's a climate record that's there as well. These balloons are also used, the radiosondes are also used as a ground truth for satellites. We invest a lot in new satellite technology to be able to make sure that the satellites are measuring just what we say they're measuring. We go back to these are the simple devices that are highly accurate, and we know we know how they work really well. We can do that to sort of ground truth some of the satellite information. Pollution research is also going to be impacted because we don't have these observations. So loss of data on that part. There's also infrastructure impacts. David also mentioned the radars that we have across the country. These are called 88D radars. That 88 comes from 1988 when they were first put into operations, these NextRad radars. There's talk about closing the Radar Operations Center out in Norman, Oklahoma. That's a building, maybe not renewing the lease. In that building, there are individuals that are, you asked a question earlier, what are folks doing at NOAA throughout the day? There are folks in that building right now that are looking at the entire network of 88D radars all across this country and Puerto Rico, all the way out to Guam, monitoring how well they're working. And if are there any issues or repairs that are needed, these are experts that know precisely, specifically for these radars, what has to be done. They can send or order technicians to go out. But we've had a loss of technicians, so there's going to be a loss of the timeliness in getting some of the radars back up to speed. So these are some of the things that will certainly be lost. Again, the staffing shortages that were present even before they had these reductions in force and voluntary retirements means just basically a degradation in service. There's also the other component, the loss of really highly trained individuals in some of these probationary cuts that had occurred, right? Some of these probationary employees were actually new early career folks that are bringing in a skill set that frankly, I don't have. And a lot of folks that have been in the Weather Service for a while don't have. These are folks that know about Python, know about machine learning and data science that we're going to help move the Weather Service into its next generation of modeling and model development. These are folks that are dedicated. I teach some of these students myself. These are folks that are really eager to go and serve the country in this capacity. They know the science. They also recognize the importance of communicating the impacts of forecast to decision makers and communities like Todd was describing. That all of this work has to be done. It's again, it's that ecosystem within NOAA, but it's also an ecosystem across different federal agencies. NOAA works closely with FEMA and other agencies to make sure that decision makers have high quality data in a timely manner to make the decisions that they have to make. Loss of that of staffing means a reduction in NOAA's ability to serve the public. And that could lead to, unfortunately, loss of lives, damage to property. And as David also mentioned, David really did a great job with laying out things, is the impact on the conduct of commerce across our country, right? Whether it's logistics, whether it's aviation safety, whether it's space weather, the impacts of space weather. We have folks monitoring the sun 24/7 to make sure there's no solar flare that could perhaps impact communications or the energy infrastructure here on the planet. So this is really an important loss. The loss of life means reduction in service, and that could translate into some far-reaching negative impacts.
Exactly. Thank you for your response, Dr. Morgan. I appreciate that you brought up the student impact there as well. I think, you know, hopefully there's some time at the end that we can talk a little bit more about the human impact of those who are caught in the middle of all this. But in particular, I know a lot of students are very worried about their future where, you know, just a few short years ago when I was, getting my meteorology degree, it's all, go into the National Weather Service forecast. And then, these opportunities are reducing and then internship opportunities are also reducing. Maybe if you wanted to go in academia and do some research yourself, those opportunities are also reducing. So the eroding of opportunities for students also will have consequences. And as you've mentioned, these are students who are now being trained to do MATLAB and Python and to code. And I don't know if folks know this, but when satellites are out there, they're not taking like a picture of what's going on. It's actually like a code that you have to decode. And then from that code, you're actually like able to make it into a picture and see what like the satellite is. And that was one of my classes from undergrad that I had to do. So these are skills, that folks coming in now have and that will be needed to replenish, folks across the entire organization. David, you currently work right now to spread the word about climate change and actively link extreme weather events to increasing global temperatures. It is unclear exactly what DOGE will do next, but we have been talking about the importance of data collection. So what would the potential reductions of data collection mean for communicating climate change and preparing for the consequences of a warmer world?
Absolutely. I'm based in the Southeast, which, does lean a certain way, but even no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, people are aware of the changes that are happening in their backyard. The winters and the summers that we are seeing today, with increasing heat, snow droughts in many areas, pests, insects, allergy seasons are not the same ones that we grew up with. It's just a matter of if people are able to place the changes that they're seeing in their communities, in their backyard, in the context of a larger global issue, such as climate change, and if they are even able to, in of themselves, say the words climate change, because that has unfortunately been such a politicized term. So, as we know, and research shows this, extreme weather events such as Hurricane Helene were impacted by our warming climate. There were studies released just in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene that found it was made X amount stronger and more likely in terms of the amount of rainfall that came through as a result of our warming oceans, which absorbed roughly around 90% of our Earth's excess heat. That is a direct link that we are seeing as of climate change into a specific extreme weather event. And the impacts go much further than that. And a lot of this is possible due to the amount of climate information that we have. I forget who mentioned it earlier with Mauna Lea, as other data sets go back around 100 years or so. And disruptions to that data set could potentially cause disruptions not to only current climate research, but future climate research as well. Because think about for anything such as like your car's history, and you have a good 10-year report, but there was a year you may have like lent it to a friend or a family member, and you're like, I don't know what happened that year. So how can you better prepare and better know what is going to happen to your car if you have a disruption in that data set. And unfortunately, we are likely going to see disruptions due to this, whether it's that brain or academic drain that you and Dr. Morgan had mentioned, not only on a national scale, but an international scale as well, or disruptions to our climate science, not only with the data itself, but how people access that data, whether it's through government websites, which, as we know, have been getting pulled away if it even mentions the word climate change, or it could just be through people talking about their research. It was earlier this month that NCEI, based out of Asheville, by the way, would be suspending its regular climate talks talking about climate research because they didn't have the staff, the public information and communication staff at NOAA. And unfortunately, that's where we're seeing a significant reduction at NOAA, is in the communication realm of this. So there's that. Not only the disruptions to the data itself, but the disruptions to who is able to communicate this data as well. Again, the future is unclear on this, but based on what we have already seen with this administration, the disruptions to various other agencies, we have to be mindful that there could be disruptions to the climate record as well, which not only helps us get a better understanding of what's currently happening, but also a better understanding of what leads ahead. I forget who exactly at NOAA said this, but it's a really poignant quote that says, not only does climate information provide us with a better understanding of what impacts we are currently seeing due to climate change, but also gives us a stronger understanding so we can better prepare our communities with the changes that they are going to see in the future. And so we can better adapt and also better explain those impacts.
Exactly to all of that, David. Thank you so much for answering that. Todd, I'd like to wrap up the panel discussion with you really quickly. Can you talk a little bit more about the support and resources that Hurricane Helene survivors are still relying on in terms of their long-term rebuilding efforts? And maybe touch on a little bit from that on what happens if those resources goes away.
Well, right off the bat, I know our rep from FEMA was let go as part of this, and he has been boots on the ground since the hurricane was the 27th. He arrived on the 29th. He has had a long career in government, in the military, and one day he was gone. And he was attending all of our long-term recovery meetings. He was helping us gather the data for households. And it was a real lifeline for us nonprofits and community organizations that are working. So we've, for example, just in this county alone, there's still 18 households living in a hotel, and their FEMA vouchers are running out. So we have been able to go get private funding that will help to extend that stay. We will pay for that while we work to find them housing. But big housing shortage here before the hurricane, and working across 7 counties, 5 of them devastatingly impacted. There are parts of Yancey County that still don't have electricity, y'all. They still don't have electricity in Yancey County in some communities. So we are talking a years long recovery. And if our resources go away, whether that's FEMA or HUD or any of those resources that are cut back just by losing the one person, we have lost a stream of information, somebody who was kind of holding it all together and helping us that are working in this long-term recovery. So, the title of this is Forecasting Disaster, and there's a lot of disaster that we're forecasting on a lot of different fronts for us that could absolutely devastate our area for decades. And at the end of the day, it's people's lives that we're talking about.
Exactly. It's people's lives, it's people's well-being, their economic opportunities. Thank you for bringing us full circle that the impacts are not just from the National Weather Service and NOAA. There's other agencies that are providing incredible and very much important work to communities across the country that, communities rely on. And if reductions continue to happen, because they're not just at NOAA, if reductions across the all of the entire departments and agencies continue to happen, we're talking about people's lives here and people's well-beings, and it's the connection is easy to make there. So
Well,
thank you.
Lucera, if I can add one more thing too, the
Yeah.
winter, this is a very harsh winter on top of the hurricane. And again, without our connections with National Weather Service and the data and information that NOAA, I mean, we literally drive the roads and go to the encampments and load people up and bring them inside when we know, we're not 30-degree wind chill, -30 wind chill is what we're talking about in the mountains of North Carolina. People are going to die if we do not have these resources.
Exactly this. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for utilizing the resources that are out there. And thank you again for sharing your story. Thank you to the panelists for being here. We'll move on to our audience Q&A now. Thank you to those who have submitted questions. The first one is here from Jordan Woolman from Politico. Can the panelists talk a little bit about the impacts of the NOAA National Weather Service cuts for farmers? What is the damage done for our food systems and production? And Dr. Morgan, I'll start with you.
Okay, thanks for the question. The Weather Service provides timely forecasts both on the short term, the next couple of days, but also seasonal and sub-seasonal forecast. And I can't speak to cuts that have occurred at this point, but if we see loss of staffing in the groups that do work on this seasonal, sub-seasonal forecasting, and this is talking about several weeks out to a couple months, will later this spring be wetter or drier than normal? When we look ahead toward summer and fall, the time when people are beginning to harvest some crops, what are the conditions going to be? Loss of that capacity to provide timely forecast and analysis of those conditions is going to mean agriculture is going to be impacted. If you're looking at the harvesting of crops and moving them on barges down the Mississippi, knowing what the flow rate is in the Mississippi, knowing, is there flooding that's occurring or the levels of water in the Mississippi dry, can mean you delay the timely arrival of those crops to, Louisiana and ports so they can get shipped elsewhere in the world, if that's where these crops are going. So the loss of accurate and timely forecasts are going to be impacted. But I want to also say something about impacts that I missed. I don't think I said clearly. The loss of staffing means a slowdown in innovations that are occurring within the agency. And that innovation includes the development of the next generation of models that are seen as highly performing, very accurate. We don't have the staff to be able to further the development of those models, which means a few years from now, people are going to be interested in some of those longer term forecasts and want to see improvement and greater accuracy. We may miss that because we're now cutting off our ability to do that right now, the basic research that's going to lead to innovations down the road. So agricultural forecasting, obviously both the short term as well as seasonal forecasts may be degraded. Again, it really depends on specifically where the cuts are, and the Weather Service folks are eager to keep things moving forward and keep that. But again, the challenge is loss of staffing.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan, for answering that question. Hey, David, during the hurricane season, we often see path predictions made in the United States, as well as the path predicted by a European Weather Service. Will the European Weather Service help us if NOAA and the National Weather Service is badly compromised?
Yeah, so those are kind of like that spaghetti map, like just a handful of spaghetti thrown on essentially a map of the United States and the Atlantic and the Gulf during hurricane season. And some of those, again, come from the European model. Some of them come from a Canadian model. Some come from a Japanese model. But the majority of what our overall nationwide forecasting comes from is American model. We call it the GFS, or the Global Forecast System, which is also important to note because, again, these impacts that we're seeing to NOAA aren't only going to impact us, it's going to be a worldwide impact as well, especially as we head into the hurricane season. I think one aspect that I think a lot of people need to pay attention to is the National Hurricane Center, which again is housed under NOAA. Not only issues forecasts and alerts for the country, but also the number of nations that fall within the Atlantic and Pacific basins, which it covers. The ocean has no borders. So the areas that are impacted by these hurricanes, these island nations do rely on National Hurricane Center data and forecasts. Now, it's up to the individual nations to decide how they distribute these warnings and alerts, but disruptions due to this are likely not only going to impact the US, but also the entire Atlantic as a whole. And we're already seeing some reductions with the Hurricane Hunter aircraft and some reports of some people being left on. But I think this is just a moment to mention that there is just an incredible amount of uncertainty with this organization and those that were impacted being told to come back, not come back, and then those that weren't on the chopping block. If you've ever been at an organization or a company that had layoffs, you can fully be aware of the changes that it means to the organization, those who are left, job security, but also just how they conduct themselves. And unfortunately, we're seeing that. But to answer the original question, there are possibilities for the European weather organizations to potentially step in terms of some of this. But again, it speaks to a larger issue that Dr. Morgan set up before, is we're seeing already some impacts of being lagging behind on some of these weather models with our own in-house models in the United States, and this is only going to further cause these issues to exacerbate themselves in the future.
Right. If I might, just to add to that, David's great response is, we all, the Weather Service currently does receive in real time, because it's a cooperative arrangement with all these nations around the world that have global prediction services. We share model output with each other. And so we already have access to that model output. But if when people talk about the European model, it's the European Center for Medium Range Forecast. Okay. Their focus really is on medium range. Here in the United States, we have a focus on everything from storm scale prediction, that is the next few minutes to an hour or so in terms of convection and thunderstorms and tornadoes, out to day to day, out to the medium range the next couple of weeks, and out to seasonal and sub-seasonal. So, the European Center forecast models, they're already part of the process. They're embedded in that process, but it's about having staff that interpret it locally for some of these really high resolution, short-term forecast impacts that these other groups and other nations don't have those concerns, and frankly, don't have the expertise in those areas or the staffing to help us with that. So this is something that we really have built an enterprise within the United States that works really well within the federal government, but also with private sector partners as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Morgan. I think it's very important to note exactly what you just said, that there are different layers to doing a forecast. There are some models that that are more geared towards predicting within the next minutes to the next hours, but that model isn't going to run as well as a different model that can predict more longer term. And there's different ingredients that goes into each models that make each model effective for the purpose that they serve. And so I appreciate that answer. And then David, yeah, hurricane hunters are very important. For those who don't know, they literally go into hurricanes and collect data, and they're able to go back to, the National Hurricane Center and say, actually the pressure of this hurricane is much, lower than we anticipated. And so let's adjust there too. And so they're able to provide real-time data that help us, adjust our forecasts and things like that. So very, very important. The next question, I'll start with Dr. Morgan, and then David, please jump in. Project 2025 had a lot to say about NOAA and specifically says it should be broken up and downsized, and that its functions could be provided commercially. The question from the audience is if the panelists can speak on this, so Dr. Morgan and David, what are the risks of privatizing this work? I hear from proponents that the private sector can do this more cheaply and effectively. Please walk us through why this work is not suitable for the private or for-profit sector.
Okay, well, first of all, when they say that the work can be done more cheaply, the question is what work? And as David and Todd have said, a lot of the work that is done in terms of developing a forecast and communicating it out to the public is a result of significant investments we've made in infrastructure, our satellites, our radars, our buoys, the ships and aircraft that take the observations, and those are investments that are made to support the infrastructure of the Weather Service in producing timely, accurate forecasts. So what is the private sector interested in picking up? In fact, I don't think I've seen yet a private sector company that's willing to stand up and do this, the end-to-end observations to dissemination of forecast information. But one of the key points I want to make that's really lacking in this discussion of privatizing is the importance of equity in the delivery of services. The privates, NOAA's and National Weather Service have a particular focus on, they're driven by the mission of science, service, and stewardship, not on making a profit. For-profit private sector companies have an interest in that. And so, as I mentioned before, we've paid for this data, right? The data is out there and we're making it publicly available, helping to create an ecosystem outside of NOAA where the private sector can do specialized forecasting for particular events, right? You have private sector companies working for FedEx or for UPS and things of that sort. So if it's privatized, my fear, my concern is that the ability of individuals to get timely data, effectively, it's already been paid for, but it's been processed and delivered by the Weather Service, that's going to be compromised. Because if every time you need to get a forecast or an observation, you have to go and pay for it, people are either going to be reluctant to do it, and that's going to result again in the lack of timely updates for communities that are interested in public safety, or companies that are interested in using what used to be Weather Service products in their own development. So it's going to stifle innovation in the private sector. It's just going to squash it. So, and then finally, who's willing to step up and take on the risk of poor forecast? Are they going to be indemnified? Are they going to take the responsibility if a forecast is blown? The Weather Service, being part of a federal government, has some borders around it that keep it from litigation and things of that sort. Are private sector companies willing to step up and take that on themselves? So it's about what do they want to do and how do they want to do it. I think the challenge, again, really, and my biggest concern is the equity and making sure everyone can get access to this data in a way that's both timely, it's safe, it's secure, it's built on scientific integrity, and also just, what part of this enterprise are they willing to take on? I don't see anyone going from, again, fundamental observations all the way out to dissemination of high quality, timely forecast.
Well, Sarah, can I just jump in there really quick? Because I was going to echo that earlier because I made note of what Dr. Morgan said in the very beginning, that we make this information available for free. Not everything should be for sale. Not everything should be for profit. Because this, like, as an agency, we'd have to add another line on our budget. We have to pay for a report every time something comes out. We don't have the time to do that. We don't have the funding to do that. And lives will be lost. This is suddenly that business is the answer, because the business goal is making a profit. They are not about helping people. This NOAA and the whole organization, National Weather Service, is about helping people. And that should be the job of the federal government. That is the job of the federal government at the end of the day, is helping people, not trying to make a profit.
I know we're running short on time, so I'll just keep a very quick elevator pitch. If you want to talk more about this, buy me a drink at a bar, ask any meteorologist this. They will talk about it for a very long time. But I echo the sentiments of Dr. Morgan and Todd. NOAA and the National Weather Service offer a public good, and it's paid for by your tax dollars, again, for roughly the price of a cup of coffee per year. And if we see disruptions to that from the private sector, we are going to see not only public safety go down, but also the validity of these forecasts go down. As we know in government, often we see things sold to the lowest bidder. And in terms of weather forecasts, I don't think that should be the case. And also, even the private companies that were named in Project 2025, they don't want this. Even if you want to think about even just like one little small subsect of it, about the possible litigation of offering alerts and offering warnings. What happens if the warning came too late? Or what if the warning wasn't issued? They would open themselves to possible litigation and anything like that. And then to end everything, a lot of this goes back to equity. It needs to be said. The data and everything that the National Weather Service and NOAA provides is provided not only for the US citizens, but across the world free of charge. And that allows communities, small rural communities, to prepare themselves the same way that urban communities would. And when we look at areas such as Asheville, Boone, they're able to plan a better future together with understanding that climate change is fueling more intense, stronger hurricanes and extreme wildfires and anything like this with data that NOAA provides, the same way that others in urban areas can also provide. So again, NOAA is a public good and it is equitable for the entire population.
Thank you, David. I think you summarized it all beautiful, put in a little bow there that this is all very important work. The equity is a huge issue, as why it should stay in NOAA, why forecasting should be a public good. So to our audience, a recording of this event will be available at americanprogress.org/events, where you can register for all of CAP's upcoming events, including the other webinars in this specific series, and watch recordings of previous events. Thank you to the audience for attending, and a huge major thank you to Dr. Michael Morgan, David Dixon, and Todd Carter for participating and for the fruitful discussion and Q&A. Thank you all, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their Monday.